First of all, what even is trade? By now, the following definition should be fairly familiar. Trade involves the buying and selling of goods and services, with payment given to the seller from the buyer. Very simply, trade is the exchange of goods and services between individuals, groups, or countries. Moyo introduces this chapter by discussing China's relationship in respect to trade with Africa. Trading with Africa is very important to China, so much so that in late 2005, China's premier stated that China's trade with Africa would increase by about 100 billion United States dollars every year within a span of 5 years. Although trade sometimes is tied with negative ideas, trade in itself is a good thing, and it has many positive benefits. According to economic theory, trade contributes to growth in the following two ways. Trade increases the actual amount of goods and services that a country sells to foreign markets. So, the more trade there is, the more amount of goods and services will be demanded, which forces the country to produce more of the goods and services that they are selling abroad. The second way that trade contributes to growth is that trade increases the overall productivity of the workforce. Moyo provides a prime example. Instead of just being able to sell 500 mosquito nets, they can now sell around 1,000 mosquito nets, because the maker of the mosquito nets can export half of them to other countries who do not make these nets or who do not make enough of these nets for their population. Due to trade, countries are generally categorized into the following three groups. The first of these, the winning globalizers. These are countries who have increased their trade and have seen increased economic growth. Prime example is China. The second category is non-globalizers. These are countries who deliberately avoid using or abstain from trade, which in turn has not led to much economic growth. The third and final category are the losing globalizers. These are countries who have increased their trade, but unfortunately have not seen much, if any, increased economic growth. The prime example are many African countries.
Through the provisions of these subsidies by Western governments to Western farmers are able to sell their products above world market price and dump the excess production in the international market at lower prices. Although greatly benefiting the West, this is detrimental to African markets. The cheaper excess goods from the West are undercutting African farmers, making developing countries unable to compete. Moyo utilizes two specific examples, cotton and sugar, which are two of Africa's main exports. She supports this example with specific statistics regarding the amount of money the countries lost due to foreign subsidies. In 2003, the U.S. implemented more cotton subsidies in the entire GDP of Burkina Faso. As a result, Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali filed an official complaint stating that the U.S. stole approximately $1 billion a year due to subsidies. For example, Mali lost 2% of their GDP and 8% of their export earnings. Benin also lost 2% of their GDP and 9% of their export earnings. Burkina Faso lost 1% of their GDP and 12% of their export earnings. If there is a 40% reduction in their world price, that would imply a 7% reduction in rural income. Developed countries aren't the only ones distorting the trade market. China supported its cotton sector with $1.5 billion annually. Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, Egypt, and India have all put $0.6 billion in their cotton sectors as well. On the other hand, Moyo argues that Africa itself is a major part of the problem. African countries impose an average tariff of 34% on agricultural products from other African nations, so there isn't much trade between African countries. Therefore, trade between African countries only account for 10% of their total exports.
Moyo explained that the most notable Western efforts to trade for Africa had been the U.S. African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, of 2000, and Europe's Everything But Arms, EBA. She explained that these two efforts might explain why the Africa's share of global trade is at 1%. In 2003, AGOA exports were more than $14 million. Moyo argued that only a small amount of African countries have been benefited from oil-rich and larger economies. An example of these countries are Nigeria, South Africa, Gabon, and Lesotho, were accounted for more than 90% of AGOA duty-free benefits for their export value. Petroleum products were at 80%, with textiles and clothes accounting for $1.2 billion US.
Africa has many resources. It has tea in Kenya, coffee in Uganda, beef in Botswana, oil in Gabon, cotton in Mali, and much more. With all of this supply, the Africans won't need all the goods, so they'll trade to countries like China, where the economy is getting wealthier and more greedy thanks to its supply of copper, tin, and aluminum. But Africa still has products China needs to survive. The Chinese can use the cotton from Mali for clothes and drink the tea and coffee from Kenya and Uganda. The Chinese will need to propel its engines so they can get oil from Gabon. With a fraction of China's population being in the middle class, Africa can supply for it as it grows. Although trade has been increasing in Africa, there are still way too many African countries that aren't participating, whether it be because they are incapable or because they're unwilling.
Although Moyo's arguments for trade make economic sense, she also glosses over some of the possible counter-arguments against trade. Like Moyo mentions, trade is generally seen as a positive thing by most economists. At the same time, there are reasons for why people are opposed to it. One counter-argument would be that trading means domestic industries are in stronger competition and might find it more difficult to continue with falling revenues. People are laid off and entire towns have the potential to suffer. Although this unemployment might only be temporary, negative effects like these are felt much more personally by the unemployed workers. Also, although Moyo makes a strong argument against the use of subsidies, the halting of agriculture subsidizing in Europe, India, China, and the US could come with its own negative consequences. Farmers in all of these countries would probably be outraged, considering the increase in production costs that they would experience relative to when they were subsidized. Besides these holes in her argument, Moyo brings up a lot of convincing points about why Africa needs to develop its international and internal trade. By taking steps to improve trade, Africa may be able to lessen some of the economic struggles that it has been experiencing since colonization.